pleased to be here. This is a theater I've done many different things in, but I've never talked on it. So I'd like to thank Rajshri for allowing this to happen, and I'll start off immediately on what the first point will be. Once upon a time. Once upon a time is a phrase that takes us immediately into the world of magic, the world of fairy tales, the world of make-believe, a world where anything can happen, all is possible, there is great beauty, and what better word to start off for what I'm asked to do very often as a scenographer. Because that is the challenge of being a scenographer. You're always asked to do the impossible or the magical. You're expected to be the wizard, the magician, the transformer, the alchemist. It's a word I really like because alchemy, by definition, is a philosophy that aims at the transmutation and transformation of base metals into gold. And working with very basic materials, sometimes very low budgets, you're expected to transform, create, and change an ambience, change an emotion, change a feeling, and create a memory, and a beautiful memory, and a strong one, a powerful one. So it's a very privileged space. And this route, what I would like to do is to take you on a journey, or take you on the journey, of how I've found ways to create a vocabulary to make this possible, because that is what is demanded each time, every time there's a project. And this is something that I did years ago as a student at NID. It's a version of the word calligraphy because, at that time of the word kriti or creation. Because as a student, one was looking, what is my passion? What am I going to do for the rest of my life? What is it going to be? And this was something I did as a calligraphic project. It makes sense because you have akriti, which is form, prakriti, which is nature, kritya, which is the act of creation, and kritikar, which is the creator or the maker or God maybe. So there are many ways to see it. And calligraphy is something I've held on to on and off over the years because it's been my inroad into doing something personal. Because as you start doing larger and larger projects, you delegate more and more and you become less a person who's doing something by yourself. And it becomes something that you feel that one is losing. And this was something I did with an artist called Nilima Sheikh, and that's where the word on collaboration comes in, because in the process of search, I found that theater and dance, they were my loves growing up. And I think that that's a world I would have joined if I hadn't joined design at that point of time. And with theater, you're collaborating with lighting designers, with actors, with directors, with dancers, with musicians. It's a process where there's no one person who's entirely in control. And this was a painting that was 38 feet by 5 feet for the Asia Society, and it was great fun collaborating on it. So in the process of theater and dance, I bring in the word collaborators and collaborations and understanding what the needs are, what tastes are, and whose vision is where does your vision step in, how do you start developing a vision and starting to trust a vision that you can have. So this, for example, is a calligraphy project I did with a dancer. In fact, so I'm doing live calligraphy through it. He dances, and then the image and the word have some kind of connect. At points, I use his silhouettes to form lines on it. Sometimes I paint on him, and this is about 10 years ago. But it was a project where I was exploring the possible use of word and text and form and dance. This is another project, a play which was set in a kitchen. So it was all about recipes at the back in Hindi and Punjabi. It was a Punjabi play. And the actors kept singing through it. They were the chorus, but they also kept cooking through it and feeding the audience. So that was very, very popular and very successful. Another person who I worked with at that point was Chandralekha, whom I think of as there are certain people you meet in your life and you say they are alchemists. They're people who transform a vision, they transform of a generation, of how people saw Indian dance, of how philosophies were developed and that we follow till today. And I think one is lucky if in one's life you meet a few people like that who become these alchemist, because, mentors, or in the way the world is changing now, you can't really have a path that you can follow. You have to make your own path. So these are some of the alchemists that I've met. There's Chandralekha, there's Ariane Mouchkine, the cartoucherie in France, Peter Brook at the Bouffe du Nord in Paris, Robert Wilson in America at the Watermill Center. And they all inspired me to try different aspects of things. So I tried to be a performer for 5 years. Not tried, I was a performer on and off in between all that I did. I used to be a long-haired person, as you can see. And it taught me to understand what the other side of being on that fence was. So whether it was with costume, whether it was with playing different kinds of roles, whether it was leading on to a bigger project. And this was for me an important project about 12, 13 years ago in Bombay. It was a musical on the Mahabharata, where I created these big machines which moved around. One person could push them. It took a while to get to that. But they came together, they were like drawbridges, they became steps, they came down, or they came together, they became a stage. And the space transformed without there being a blackout or a stop or a change of any kind. It was just fluid. It kept moving, except for the interval in between. And all of this taught me that one very important thing in all this magic is lighting. You will only see what you light and how you light it. And if you don't light it, you don't see it. So you can do something fabulous and fantastic. But if you can't see it, it's no point whatsoever. So for a little while, I was a lighting designer for a couple of companies. This is a dancer friend in the South. She took off from where Chandralekha left off, and I worked with her for about 10, 12 years. It was very minimal, very slow, very rigorous. And therefore, the lighting had to be very minimal, very clean, and the set had to be absolutely minimal as well, as did the costume. And so that was a challenge, because, as Indians, we tend to be multi-layered. Our sense is to do, more is more, not less is more. Versus, this is an important production that happened here on this stage, which is A Midsummer Night's Dream, for which I took the stage and the design. So these are the costume images. But the stage was just a wooden grid, because we did it with local materials available in Pondicherry. And it was a grid, and it was covered in paper. So it looked solid. And then the floor was red earth, because that's the earth we found then we liked, covered in silk. And then the silk is whisked away by Puck, the little magic creature. And the next scene happens, and then the fairies burst through the paper at one magic moment. And in that process, that solid wall slowly shreds to the play and becomes the forest. So as people climb up and down, so it's very organic. You never know what's going to happen each day. Sometimes a big chunk comes off, sometimes it's a little piece. It's entirely dependent on what the material chooses to do, which was great fun, because it kept everyone on their toes and alive, and no one got bored. There was lots of aerial activity, so people went up and down. So it was a very good three-dimensional use of space. And that's Titania in her bow. That's the donkey. And that's the king on his little perch. That's when the lovers are in the forest, and they keep winding, Puck keeps winding the elastic around, so they get caught up in it and tied up and knotted. And so that was a very, very beautiful scene, actually. And then in the interval, suddenly, they themselves take all the paper down, and it's stripped bare, and it becomes a separate kind of sculpture altogether. And then at the end, the fabrics come down, and it becomes the court again, so there's softness back in the space. I had a big challenge when we went to Australia, because at that point we understood and realized that in America, when we were going on tour, we couldn't use paper. They had some union issues. So I had to suddenly come up with another quick reusable option. So luckily we were next to a place near Perth called Fremantle, where I went and I found some sail makers and found sail material. And working with that made something, it wasn't, I was heartbroken, but made something that could at least give us the same feel and could be just velcroed back together and used again. And it had to be fire retardant, and there are all these things that happen when you're traveling and touring around. So now moving on to some of the transformative installations that I'm talking about, which mean that when you walk into a space, or you're given a brief, or you're given a direction, you have to start recognizing the invisible structures and the invisible geometries in that space. So this is an old project, but again, something that marked me, and we actually did this in Bombay at the NCPA in the Millennium Year, I think for the Kalagura Festival. It was on for 3 months. These were large structures made of kite material and fan and wood. I had to make them myself in Germany. They went up and down. They were inspired by these Christmas decorations which have candles at the corners, and they would light up, they had little pillars, and they turn round and round. And that same principle worked here, because if they were low enough and just above the performers, if the dancers moved, this whole thing started moving. And I used it very successfully with dancers, but again in a music festival in the UK, where I worked with them and other elements of shredded fabric, where this was a big top tent, a club tent for 7,000 people, and as more and more people came to the tent and the heat became more, these fans started going faster and faster. So it's one of those accidents of design which are beautiful. These forms in fabric are another thing that I'm very excited by, because saving material in India means you can work mainly with fabric, you can work with thread. You're limited because metal and everything else is quite expensive. So this was done with Harmony Fabrics for the Harmony show, again the Millennium Year, but working with how do you have a different experience as you walk through the tunnel. And then using that and turning them and working with other parachute materials for a digital film festival. Or working on an installation for the French embassy, which was on for 2 years, but working with very cheap materials, thin metal, but having to be made impeccably so that it looks finished, looks complete. And they had bulbs inside so that at night they would come in. LED hadn't come in yet then in a big way. Or when you're given a structure like a tree, and this is something I do every year, it's a Bhakti Music Festival at Nehru Park in Delhi, and it's a beautiful tree. So then you see an invisible structure, you make use of it, add the fabric, put on some flowers, add the diyas, and you've got a venue, which is soulful, which is calming, soothing, not over the top, versus something like this, which is NH7, the music festival which happens every year. So last year I was pulled into it, and in Delhi at the Formula One track, it's just massive. My heart sank when I got there because it was just open ground of a huge area with no definition, not a tree in sight, just flat. So then we had to find things to create pathways and create a geometry between the 6 stages and all the different activities that had to take place. So by adding color on the walls, by adding these flags which were in different color coordinations, by being inspired by Christo and saying, okay, now that was expensive and took many years, but with available things with tent guys, what do you do? And with cheap materials, what do you do that will work with the wind? And I think the result was something that I was very pleased by, because you had multiple rows of these and multiple colors and stripes, and it was something which, for a young festival, the color and the pathway gave us all direction and created enclaves and corners and spaces to work with. This is the India Art Fair last year. I was working with wool. Again, very low budgets. Luckily, Jindal Steel, Sangeeta Jindal, had given us 60 tons of steel. So I worked with all the steel to make metal structures, but then with the wool. So it was called thick and thin. So it was things that were hard and things that were soft and things that were colored, things that were rusted in contrast to each other. And these were all the forms, because there's something very tactile and architectural about using materials like this. You can twist and turn and form all kinds of shapes. Outside we had metal flooring and metal structures, and the entrances were made of, gradations and rhythms of metal, and there were bamboo forests going up to 36 feet in between to hide certain things, or frames inside where I call this twist and shout, where as you turned and walked, the colors were different. But my favorite was the pinball. You can see at the end that there's a wooden shape, because this is like the pinball game that you play, where you put your hand and you get the shape of your hand or your face or whatever it might be. So we made something like this laser cut, and then got all these thousands of pipes and created these walls, and I would set it every day. It would stay set for a few hours, but children would come, people would play with it, and by the end of the day it would become something else, and you'd have little silhouettes and things. So it was quite an active space in the VIP lounge of the art fair. This year, the art fair, we used a lot of color. I still use thread, but in a completely different format, not with twists and turns. It was because the color was there in the background. But what I did do was work with the facade, where we worked with the kind, jalis are another thing which are very Indian, but are beautiful, and it's something that's being used a lot and is very in right now in different ways. So I was working with the leaf jali, or a kind of leaf form, a grid. But it had a reflective covering. It was cheap. It was on sunboard, and lots of it so that you could see the reflection of the venue, in a sense, but intangibly. And inside, because the space has a pyramid on the top, I worked out a different sculpture, again with wool. So this is something that we've done 2 years in a row, just to find different depths and forms and sculptures over here. You can see how it all actually has to be tied somewhere, and then you make a detail out of that. This was for the launch of the Architectural Digest last year, so this was like a street in New York maybe. So structures at different heights, but again with the same twists and forms, but kind of there and yet not there. This is something that happened a few months ago. This also happened in Bombay at Mehboob Studio. This is a installation exhibition for Tarun Tahiliani. So this was great fun because it was tedious, it took a long time, but it was again collaborating with the people making it, because one doesn't have the know-how initially, and then you learn, how do you work with glass? He wanted something that was modern yet classic. So how do you create something that is there yet not there, yet the form is something that's classic, yet the material is completely transparent. Some of the mannequins were suspended on glass, so their shadows are floating, which is a great feeling, because it's a scary thing to try and do for yourself, but you can put mannequins on it. And things like the doorways, because those are intangible, and it also made sure that no one walked into the glass. One small time where I worked with film was when I was working with Bollywood. So this was in Bombay, some wild time ago. But it was fun as an experience. It just taught me that it's not what I wanted to do. Where working with things like golden waterfalls and sets for dancers, and it was an interesting experience, contrasting directly to, say, going to Sri Lanka, which is what I had to do here, for a few months to work on the film Water for Deepa Mehta, where because of all the chaos they had, and they were thrown out of Banaras in 2000, when they finally shot the film, it had to be done in Sri Lanka. So what I had to work with and create was a space like Banaras in Sri Lanka, and there was really nothing there. The Sri Lankans are quite different. So certain things we ship from here, like, say, the Banaras umbrellas, but everything else, from the ghats to the temples to the dressing, all of that we had to really do over there. So I had to do trips to Banaras to just, stay up nights, try and sneak some short videos to understand how the rituals happen, because how else do you get the details correct? And that was quite an experience. The next stage, there are different lessons that come in each of these, It's different kinds of collaborations, different kinds of inputs, different scales. Was when I started working with fashion and Fashion Week. In fact, the first show was here in Bombay some years ago. And that was a different kind of working and a different kind of persona, the fashion designer, and dealing with them. And it was about a different kind of, you talk about the zeitgeist and the spirit of the times, but there is the spirit of the actual time as it is, but the trends and fashion and how that works is different, so it's a different kind of awareness. So I often felt like a hummingbird, where, a hummingbird is seemingly static, but there's a great deal of energy being expended as it's fluttering on that one spot. And that was what I felt I was doing a lot with fashion, and still do sometimes, where you're creating these dreams and these ideas in these images and these fantasies. Or, at least over here I did get theatrical, where if there are lotuses rising and then models arrive, or there are performers that happen, or there are jali screens that happen, or that you're in the middle of a Mughal garden, or someone wants something very operatic, or twisted frames on a twisted set, or going on to things and they come in from in between the frames, or someone wants an enchanted forest, so this is all made of paper, this is entirely paper cut. So the same rules apply. How do you make something be much more? A plus B doesn't become, 1 plus 1 doesn't become 2, it has to become 200. And how do you manage to make that happen with light, with texture, with material, and with things that are going to be ephemeral? And that's the key thing that I have lived with all this time, that this is a world of the ephemeral. And in a sense, it's a lot like life, because life changes all the time. This is just life in fast motion, I think. And this is a set where there was a moon at the beginning. The moon slowly, it's a moon box, so it's backlit, then it becomes a quarter and a half, and then disappears. And then the other lights come on, so it becomes a different kind of enchanted forest. This was a set where there were lotuses, and they were floating over a ramp of water. So there were no shoes, but the models walked in water. So it's fun sometimes to work these fantasies out, but then you're trying to also find meaning in projects and to see how it all comes together. This was a show for Being Human, raising money for Salman Khan. So since it was about his paintings being sold, the backdrop was just a slightly angled backdrop, and paint kept dripping through the show. Red, blue, green, and at the end black. And there were children drawing each other and silhouettes on the floor through it, and there was a lot of choreography, and people signed on it. So it became an active, dynamic idea that worked. This is a forest again, but made of PVC pipes. This is working with laser. This was a launch of a car with Rohit Bal, who's a well-known fashion designer. So I just went to the junkyards, got lots of junk, put it together. And so it still stayed like a workshop, but it was more than a workshop because the backdrop was something which was filled with parts. It was very labor intensive. It's something you can only do here in India, at least so far. Someone wanted a cathedral. This was, the brief over here was Mykonos meets Studio 54. So I took the forms of Mykonos, covered it with glass, with little glass, so that it looked like a mirror ball, and it worked. Only thing, in these shows, you have 3 hours to set it up, or 2 hours actually. So you try and do things at night, rip off things. It's quite an experience watching a Lakme grand finale happen, because there are about 50 people, and how no one gets hurt or killed is beyond me. This was a very low ramp, in the sense a very low roof. So I worked with the idea of time and created a lot of cogs, so that the lack of height became an advantage, that what you were seeing was layering over here. So that was a different kind of treatment of when you're constrained by space, what do you do? Here they wanted to work with technology, so it was laser and mirrors. You can't tell where one is finishing, where one is starting. This was a beautiful set. This was kind of, it was a lot of filigree work in the clothes, so that was the key point to take off. So one worked with these forms, and they rose off the girls at the beginning, and then they hung suspended over the ramp at the end. But it was quite beautiful, and so even the backdrop was entirely made of paper of a kind. So when it glowed, the texture of that is something else. This is a real forest created for a show, with lots and lots of leaves and dried leaves and whatever, with the Daniels painting at the backdrop. So this is a fantasy of another kind, but it was very effective. This is becoming more permanent because these have to last longer. This becomes more like a store in a sense. That's kind of Dali inspired, but there's thread work still. There's forms that are made. There's a clock at the back which is spiral. There's paint in various shades, so it has its own thing. This is at the Grand Hyatt Hotel here, so it's kind of against the glass. And you can see the spiral mirror which spirals out into the open area behind on a mirror wall. This is something more permanent we've just done for the Olive in Delhi. It's a bar upstairs and downstairs called the Dirty Martini. I haven't got great photographs, but Olive is a restaurant here, and they've kind of gone against their Mediterranean feel and allowed the creation of something very flapper, and this I have to thank Sabina for. The bar, where we had all things from actual lamps, but the tops were made of still a kind of a thread detail. So essentially, the clients are one kind of collaborator, because in the kind of work I do, and you'll see in the next stage, it's very important. I have to stay in touch with them all the time, and I'm trying to make sure that my team stays in touch with them more and more, because otherwise I become the bottleneck at the top. And that instinct and sense of who are they, what do they do, doesn't come through. But the main collaborators at the stage of production become the people who, if there's a craftsperson you're working with, if it's a welder you're working with, if it's a production team you're working with, because very often the solution comes from them. Sometimes it's another architect, sometimes it's a fabric designer, textile designer, graphic person. It's a lot of people who come in and out of projects, and that's what you've been hearing from all other people so far as well. And sometimes you're asked to do odd things, like I had to put up a giant screen for the launch of Vogue in Jodhpur. So how do you stitch it? How do you get it up? How do you not put nails into the structure? You improvise. And improvisation is really a key part of it. In theater, you improvise, so it was very easy for me to assign that to design or to art in that sense. And this was an exhibition of old photographs we had to do. For Vogue, again, when they had a shawl show, very little money, how do you make it interesting? Or for their 5th anniversary just now, hotel space, how do you, within a few hours, transform, change it, and make it look like something else? With Aubrey Beardsley-inspired images in black and white to contrast the Renaissance project. And then taking that onto the stage, where the stage was a long thing along the long length of the room with pillars, with the same kind of imagery, but the images are actually on louvers. So at some point, the louvers open, slide off, disappear, and then you have something else happening. So how do you reveal? How do you make a shift? How do you get that R factor on an event or at a moment, or to shift at the energy or emotion? This was for Swarovski. I've done a lot of work with them and their trend forums and their multiple events with them over the years. I didn't know how to work with crystal initially. It was quite alien to me, but I kind of now have the hang of it. And these are large images of all the participants, but used very effectively for something like the press conference, for example. They just exchanged it for each other. So for one of the designers, this was just a lot of mirror, and there was a projection at the back, so it became like a kaleidoscopic space. This was for another designer. It became very much about nature because these are different trends, so it's all about pebbles, and the pebbles going into the print of the dress, into the crystal on the dress. This was another structure here, again in Bombay, inspired by the Jantar Mantar. The Jantar Mantar, both in, it's a very inspiring astronomical architectural structure that we have both in Delhi, Jaipur, and a couple of other places. And this was for Swarovski, trying to find something old and new, and working with their forms, these astronomical giant instruments, but semi in the glass, semi out, but just made of metal and silver ribbon. So again, it's a matter of constraint. How do you manage to do a lot more than you can with a finite amount of material, time, and money? And there were candles going up it in acrylic, so I call it my stairway to heaven. This is just blow-ups of Michelangelo's David, and these are versions of that with crystal. This was for their anniversary. This was quite beautiful because this was an entrance where you walk into a space, it looks tiny, and you walk in and suddenly it's huge because it's mirrored and it's full of crystal. So excess of something is something that sometimes it's better to use one thing and lots of it sometimes when in doubt, because it works. So that was one lesson here. This was for Dior when they were launching over here. And craft, which means you need to have skills and abilities and experience. And like I said, you need to develop your antenna to listen to the collaborator or client, to read between the lines, to follow institution, and to research intelligently. So I have these are a few of my favorite things list, where I use to get to know a person very quickly and find out whether the space I need to do is sacred or meditative or celebratory or sensual. So I'm just going to let these images flow by. So you see different images. These are all events, weddings, parties. This is made of banana stem and tender coconut leaf, and it floats in the sky as well. Someone had a carriage, so painted differently for different events. Structures built for a venue. But it was a Bollywood theme, so I used the ghungats for the bar. This is for a James Bond event, so how do you work something out which looks like the entrance of the shutter, Goldfinger, Moulin Rouge. someone's 60th birthday, someone who liked jazz very much, in a hotel. So overnight, how do you transform it into a jazz bar? And the one thing I found is that you always need the 5 elements. You need earth, fire, wind, water, ether. And if you find a way to represent them somehow, the event is normally successful. Because you feel complete when all of them are there. It can be with light, it can be with matter, it can be with material, and the intangible that makes it work, which is your intuition. So if you do stages like this, or this was for these were puppets that were live, but they were 5 foot high and there were live puppeteers playing them, but the actual stage was not that. Someone wanted a Buddha bar party. Instead, I said, can we have a laughing Buddha instead? Because Buddha bar is overdone, and it worked, it was successful. These are Tanjo paintings. This was a dining area in gold paper. But the key thing is, how do you persuade them? Because once you know who they are, the list of favorite things is to find out who they are so that you can sense intuitively what will work with them, how do you enlarge their vocabulary. Because in the end, I need to like it. If I don't like it, no one else will like it, and that's very key. And that's how you bring in the vision, because I'm lucky in that sense that I work with all kinds of people, whether it's the people who are working, whether it's the kind of clients, the people I wouldn't choose to meet necessarily. And therefore, it expands my vocabulary, and that's where the alchemist comes in, because all that information comes in, it has to transform, transmute through you, and to find that metamorphorical gold, because an alchemist essentially is looking to create gold, whatever it might be, whether it's your soul, your spirit, the purity, in this case, the right thing, the dream, the fantasy, This was a Gothic party where I created a cathedral with the gargoyles, 2 floors, video mapping on the church organ, the monks were cowled, and you had this was another event. What I'm rushing to, this was Jantarman inspired, is one event that I've just done recently, which I really need to, this was a 21st birthday party, so this is stuff that I'd used. These are entrances. This was op art, op illusion. This is what I use for F1 for Lady Gaga, something similar to this. But then you take it to another level for someone who really wanted something very strong, and it had lots of elements in it, so then you're really pushing the edge on what works, but then in the excess it can work. This was the dining space for that. The spiral dining in this space. This was 100,000 square feet. Someone who wanted a Southeast Asian thematic. So those were all moving prayer wheels, which were open. So inside the lounges you could see out as you entered. These were the entries and the lounges. Tea gardens. This was recently, but this is done entirely. What I like is the simplicity of the arches and the Art Deco feel of it, and then the contrast of the floral detail. All those are floral details on the top. This was something else done last year, but I like the form because it's taking the tree leaf motif again, but with the thread installed with it. So this becomes like sculptures themselves. And with the 7 chakra elements on it, what you can do sometimes outdoors. This was in Goa, so you have these screens for shade, but lots of palm trees. So use the shade and the shadow and put it all together. So it works in multiple ways. This is in Venice. So this is like a giant palazzo for a wedding on an island, and working in Venice was crazy because to plan it, the amount of planning and production that you need to put together is something else, with performers and dancers and musicians. And this was for the Thai embassy for the Queen's anniversary. So working with, again, just thread. How do you make it light? And the roof is actually all just the gold ribbon. This is working with floral details for another roof, but waves, forms. So most of the inspirations come from nature in that sense. And then this goes on to the last project that I wanted to show you quickly, which is again the entrance space of an event done, where you enter through something quite complicated, but enter into a space where there's a giant cog on the ceiling and there are performers in the center, surrounded by LED and mirrors, so it's like a kaleidoscopic circular space. And there are performers at all the platforms during the course of the evening. And then from the other side, when you go in, what you see is this. And this is 32-foot high flower walls and shapes. It's like a spider web. And hanging in the center is like this giant chandelier, but with candles, which are floating. And the ceiling, because you had a performance of a well-known orchestra over here, and had to be grand. So it felt like a cathedral without actually being a cathedral. So it was all thousands and thousands and thousands of meters of gold ribbon that was used for this. And these were many, many petals, artificial, but they look real. And then the dining area, because we were working with a French florist who came in, and he did a fabulous job, as you'll see in the next few images, because this is working with LED, working with flowers. So it can either be layered and complex, or it can be very minimal and symbolic. Because for the same series of events, this was a space which was a day function, so you entered through a glass area, there was a water body, there were swings, people sat on swings, you had skylights, so I just made sure a lot of natural light was coming in. So this became the vocabulary. And then you had all these screens and jalis for one whole section of the space, where there were rooms of flowers. So you just walked in, walked from one space to the other, each room with different shades of flowers. And the way it works is quite complicated to work out the logistics of that. So, in the end, it's all in the detail. But essentially, I suppose what I work at is making dreams come true. So that's basically what I work at.